And now, I'd like to invite Vice Chairman of the AMP and Chairman of the Convention Steering Committee, Mr. Hazni Aris, to deliver his keynote presentation. Mr. Hazni will share more about the focus of today's convention and also updated approach it adopts. Mr. Hazni, please.
Thank you, Nusha. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. Thank you to some of our founding members, community leaders, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Badrun did a wonderful speech. What I've been tasked to do, I think it's slightly more difficult. We have done 2 years of work through the convention. So in the keynote, what I'm trying to do is I've been asked to squish everything in 30 minutes. So it's a tall order. So I thought about how we can do this. And one of the things that I thought is important for us to journey together is to take you along in terms of what we went through the last 2 years in preparing for the convention, so that where we are here today, you've probably taken the steps and understood our process. And through that, hopefully you'll be able to empathize, which is one of the key things which is a theme for this convention. So I've said all that I needed to say in terms of what we intend to journey here today. Give me a moment, I think they're changing the slides. So there will be few bits of data in which we will use to come up with the final concept of the convention. So some of the data would come on with from a big picture, which is the census done in 2020. And then we'll explain to you, after we have a snapshot of the Muslim community, more in terms of what we thought in AMP, where the gaps were, where the knowledge gaps were, and how we can add value to the research that's already done by the government. And finally, I'll share a bit more in terms of how we delve deeper into the thoughts and feelings of members of the community itself by going through in-depth interviews and focusing specifically on certain segments of the community that we feel are underserved. So there you go. Snapshots, voices of the community through our third-party research partners, and the thoughts or feelings through the work done by our panel members. And finally, I'll hand it back to all of you in terms of the ideation, which is one of the reasons why we've called all of you here this morning to provide some thought in terms of what we've done. So snapshots of the Muslim community. The census data is vast. And it's public. So basically, anybody can go online and see and decide and do an analysis on anything they want on Singapore society. So we've decided to organize it based on 3 vowels, A, E, and I. I'll start with I, and that's the most important thing in terms of who we are as a community, and that's Islam. So I'll give you a backdrop in terms of what the Muslim community, in terms of demographics, some interesting details. And we'll talk about academic, basically education, the education background of the Muslim community. So specifically for this convention, we will be looking at Singaporeans at the age of 15 and above, and as well as those who have, I'll be sharing statistics basically on people who have a diploma and above for 2 reasons. Number one is at AMP, we believe that this is the segment of our community that based on our study, there is an expectation by the community that they serve back as community advocates. So we'd like to probably explore a bit about that. And realistically, in Singapore's context, anything related to academic has a correlation, or that's the assumption we make, to economic success. But what we'll try to do is to put all of this together and create a holistic look at the Muslim community and how each one of these intertwine and intersect, how somebody who has achieved academic success, right, would probably attain some level of economic success as well, but it's always anchored based on a belief system that we share together, and some of these values, regardless of what some of our opinions are, can be agreed on, such as solidarity and social justice. A quick snapshot. We're all familiar with this. We make up 15.6% of the population, slightly more than 500,000. And this is the context which I need to share, because as we have discussions, we probably need to be aware of the context in which we operate in, that 82% of the population are ethnic Malay, and followed by the Indian community. This roughly has not changed over the last 10 years significantly. But what I've done is share with you a bit of looking instead of the Muslim community by ethnic that way. We'll look at, based on the ethnic communities, how Muslims represent. And this is the 2020 data. But what I didn't share is the change over the last 10 years has been quite significant, those in the others and the Chinese category. So in others, actually, it was around 9% in 2010, and it's now 14%. And in Chinese community, was 0.4 to 0.5. So even though generally it's been quite stable, but there are some dynamics in terms of who represents the Muslim communities in the other ethnic groups. So how does this change in terms of how we operate in the next 10 years? That will be interesting for us to observe. So I'll scale back and look at the big picture in terms of the religious composition in Singapore in general. Now, if you manage to catch very quickly, you'll see that over the last 10 years, there is more people who say that they don't have a religion, and there's a slight significant drop in most of the other religions, with the exception of Christianity and Islam. So the interesting thing about data is it probably probes more questions than it gives answers, but it gives harbinger in terms of whether does this explain some of the things that we see in recent times in terms of changing social norms on what has become more acceptable now, and based on all of this data. So that's how I'll take you through in terms of what we see in terms of the census for us to decide how next to cover some of the knowledge gaps that the census does not answer. This is the distribution of the Muslim community by age. You'll see a huge youth bulge compared to the national average. And if we look at the religious composition of youth in Singapore, right, interesting enough, even though we're 15% at the national level, within the youth category, we are a significant 20%. So that's 211 young individuals within Singapore. And the question for, if you are a community leader, should be, how do we build this this talent pool, right, to be able to be leaders of their cohort? So it's good, thought-provoking piece of information that we saw, and that helps to guide in terms of what we needed to focus on for the convention. Something else in terms of the gender composition between males and females, but also in terms of the breakdown within the youth category from 15 to 34, we see the bulk of it, a sweet spot, 25 to 29, and then followed closely by the 30 to 34. So we say, just nice. This is the group that has finished school, they're out in the workforce, they can contribute back. But we took a step back and we decided, yes, this is the group that we should reach out to, that Muslim organizations should reach out to. But at the same time, right, do we really understand what are the life priorities of this group? Right? Do we understand that, yeah, that there's a stage where career is important? Do we understand that there's a stage which they are busy setting up their own other life priorities, such as probably their own family? According to ROMM statistics, around 29, that's the age in which the groom is for Muslim marriages, and for ladies around 27. So again, the data presents more questions that we need answers. So I'll move on to the next vowel, which is E. We'll see that we've made significant gains, alhamdulillah, in terms of education attainment. Currently, right now in 2020, based on the data, there are approximately 40,000 university graduates. So if I compare to 2010, we only probably had around 17,000. So significant bulk of talents that we can tap to. And if we look at over the last 5 years itself, which is what this data shows, it's an increase of around 20%. So we have people who have a diploma and above. They represent now approximately around 13.9% of the population. But that's still significantly lower than the national count of around 45 to 46%. So the questions when we saw this data would be, so what does this mean? We've made progress, but do these graduates still face challenges in terms of employment? Right? What are the challenges they face being Muslim in finding work? Right? This is a bit of a, I would say, a provocative data. It's specific on the academic achievements by gender amongst the Muslim community. So I've intentionally blanked out all the ones which are below uh, diploma. And you can see that the women are definitely much more successful than men academically. So we'll pause here, and you look around the room, you'll see whether in terms of composition, whether we have more men or more women. This is an important question for me to ask, is because, right, if there are more women who have a degree or diploma, right, then they should have a say in terms of the influence and leadership in the Muslim community. Am I right? So maybe they've got the wrong gender standing here and giving you this speech. Yeah. But again, my point is data is interesting, it gives insights, but it also gives us questions that we need answers to. Right, this is the last bit on the vowel, which is I on income. You'll see that the Department of Statistics presents the income based on, so based on race rather than religion, but this is fine. I've already set the context that 82% of Muslims are ethnic Malay. So when we look at this, it means that the majority of Muslims here are earning below the national average. It's around 6,000, whereas the Indian community earns the highest at around 11,000. But if you look at the median, right, it's even significantly lower, right, 5,700. So does anybody remember what was the average? Anybody? The four numbers? That's 6,851, right? So what does this mean, the difference between average and median? A bit of statistics, pardon me, right? But basically, what we're trying to highlight is that when there is a difference within the Singapore community, there are more people who are earning lesser compared to more people who are earning more. So this is probably related to the Gini coefficient and more of the normal distribution of income and income inequality. So that's another discussion that we can have in another convention altogether. I just wanted to highlight and pose a question in terms of how do we solve this, right? As Muslim community leaders, that's probably most of the time at the top of our mind. And we've talked about one of the solutions, which is education. The other one is always about industry. So there you go. Wonderful, right? You've got all the data points, extremely complex. If you're a data scientist, you'll probably go back to your desk and try to work out some model on this. I'll try to summarize it for normal people like you and I. The ones which are highlighted in yellow are, again, it's based on race, but most of the Muslims are Malay. These are the top 4 industries in which the majority of Muslims are working in. And this is the sector in which contributes the most GDP, 16%. This is based on 2021 MTI data, right? So as a community leader, the first thing you do is you put on your hat and think, let's solve this, right? Let's find a solution. Number 1, we need to make sure that people have a diploma and above. Number 2, let's make sure they are in the right industry. Yeah, but is it really as simple? Right? Is it really all about material pursuits for the Muslim community? Yeah, are there other priorities that are important for people who are 25 to 34? And that's where we decided that, is this where the gap is? Is this the knowledge gap in which AMP needs to understand the Muslim community in terms of find out solutions that really cater to what is important for certain segments of our society? We talk about values. I mentioned what's important, and this is courtesy of data from MUIS 2020. The most recent annual report, I think, is 2021, where over the last 5 years, we've seen zakat contribution increase by 20% from 38 million to 51 million. Thank you, all of you in this room. I'm sure some of you are part of this significant gain. The point I would like to highlight here is that, does this make sense? Right? We have only 30% of the population that probably earn slightly higher income because they have a diploma. The median increase in terms of our income compared to the other communities is 2.8%. So even though we do have Indian Muslims who may be earning slightly more based on the statistics, but they're still a minority. So what actually explains this, that despite the lack of education and income, people still take money out of their pocket and give back to the community. Is it values? Is it belief systems? Census doesn't tell us this. Another thing which logic, right, dictates that we should not just look at rationality to come up with solutions is this, right? If all of you are looking at this data based on rational decision, you'd say, if I had $100, I should put 70% of it here, because this is where most of it is well utilized, the youth. But if we forget this segment here, they only represent 12.6%, so the national average is around 15.2 in an aging population. The question is, do we only start thinking about aging population issues when we reach 15% and above, which is above the national average? Or do we start conversations now? And this is the internal debate that we have in AMP and within the Convention Steering Committee on what are the areas that AMP should focus on, and why should we decide that we should talk about seniors now. And one of the reasons is, again, based on values, right? As a community, we put less of our seniors in care facilities. It's because we believe in filial piety, right? But what are the other challenges that will be faced by this segment here when people who are 55 and above move up here in the next 10 years? So that's where we wanted to hear the voices. So we know what the big picture is. The census data tells us this. But what do members of our community, what are they saying? And that's where we commission work from third party. We engage Black Box to do a perception survey in the midst of COVID in 2020. And we engage MyFinB to do a sentiment analysis by scanning what's being said online. The timing couldn't be better for us to try out this new way of getting voices, of hearing voices from the community, because everybody, like you and I, we were at home, and most of the time we were communicating digitally with our loved ones and family. So I share a bit more about sentiment study. This is the approach. So we spoke to close to 1,000 Muslim respondents during the period of from the period of July to August of 2020. So we had to adapt. This approach was the same one which we did for the third convention. We had to adapt it because of COVID. So we did some face-to-face and some were done virtually. And we aligned it similarly to what was done in the third convention. There was a general community perspective we were looking out for. And the issues were categorized in 6 pillars, from education all the way to economic well-being and employment. And these were the key findings on a generic basis. So we categorize based on 2 significant groups within the community and how their voices may be similar or different. One is the general community, people, normal people, and the other one, like you and I, are considered community leaders. So we'd like to hear the voices from these 2 segments and see whether how they differ or how they are similar. And it's interesting to find that we can all agree that family is important. And we can all agree that it's one of the areas of concern to people in the general community. So this is one of the first clues or the hints in terms of what we think we should focus on for the convention. And if we delve in a bit deeper, I'll just share 4 main points in terms of areas of concern that we found out during the study. So 8774, that's a mnemonic for me to remember, that 88% of people value family ties. Very important. Values, again, does that explain why people still continue to contribute to zakat despite difficulties? Maybe. Women, yeah, again, you see the census data, the link between women, and how as much as they are expected to work, they also have caregiving responsibilities. So gender-specific expectations within the community, that's reflected when we hear and we speak to members of the community. Right? The concern amongst youth for career success, right? So there's this pressure for them to be good members of the community within their families, and this pressure for them to do well in life. And lastly, I think something for all of us to think about is there is, like I mentioned, there's an expectation for Muslims to step up and be seen in positions of leadership. Yeah, so less than 4 in 10 feel that there are sufficient Muslims in positions of leadership. So that's the perception study. So that was face-to-face, and that's the traditional way in which for us to conduct the research and to get data. And this is the new way that we wanted to approach, right? So as I mentioned, there's a lot of communication done digitally now, especially over the last 2 years because of COVID. Yeah. But this data actually scans all the way back from 2010. So there's consistency in terms of us looking at over the last 10 years through the perception study and through online content that we see. So it's through social media feeds, like whatever that you post online in your Facebook and Instagram. It's also through the conventional media. So this is the sample population of the content that we got MyFinB to look through. And this is the technical, the data science behind the approaches that they took. So from here, what we managed to get were 3 recurring themes that have been spoken about over the last 10 years. So not surprisingly, education is important. And so are employment concerns, which includes cost of living. And over the last 10 years, Islamophobia. So this has been heightened because I think there's been news on terrorist-related events over the last 10 years as well, and recent incidences of discrimination based on race or religion that came out during that period of time when the study was done. But it's an interesting approach, so it gave us new perspectives, such as how people are concerned about affordability of elder care. Right? So we don't really discuss about this in a public forum, but apparently it's being discussed online. Yeah, and mental health as well. Again, these are topics which are probably considered trivial in the community or taboo. So we wouldn't be able to find this out if we probably didn't scan the internet. So, lots of data. Like I mentioned, if you're a data scientist, probably you'll love this, but for people like you and I who are looking for solutions and ways to make the Muslim community better, there are so many pain points that we see. So where do we start? What we realized is that some of these issues are actually overlapping, and some of these issues are complex and intertwining. So an approach that we could adopt was to still look at them as silos, as individually pillars, economic, religious and cultural, or we could step back and start thinking, how are segments of the community affected by the different issues? And that's where design thinking came into play. And that's where we thought that perhaps we should look at empathy, and perhaps we should probably drill down at specific segments of the community and how we can help them, rather than looking at helping everyone. So thoughts and feelings were the next step that we wanted to understand from our community. So this is the design thinking process. We start off with empathy. Through empathy map, we define the problem, and you are all here today as part of this process to help us with the ideation. And then you move on to prototyping certain type of solutions or services. You can test it out in a small group, implement it, and you go back. So it looks like a cycle, but actually it's not linear. So at any point in time, at the point where you're ideating, you realize that, hey, this is not right, based on my personal experience, and this is not what I feel. You can go back to empathize and define again. So it's a very fluid process. Yeah. And here we go. So we have the 6 pillars. And then how do we fit them into the 2 panels? So if, for example, we wanted to define seniors, the overlap we'll be able to see is healthcare issues and probably family ties, values of filial piety. And youth, as an example, like education attainment and employment. But we needed to dig deeper. These are what the data already says from our study with Black Box as well as the census. And, oh, there we go. So this is the process that the steering committee actually discussed. So it looks like there's a science to it, and it's largely data-driven, but there's also intuition. So we put ourselves into the shoes of the community, and we had to consider whether these 4 panels are current, whether they are relevant, and whether it's clear enough such that when we speak to volunteers who are now in the panel, right, they can understand and they can say, okay, good, so I have this segment of the community I think we can reach out to, we can speak to, and we can really deep dive into what else we don't know. And that's where the first step is the empathy. I couldn't emphasize this more enough. It's about listening, asking, and speaking to members of the community and finding out what they have to say. Because most of the time, this is based on Hemingway's iceberg theory, what we hear and what we say is usually at the top of the iceberg here. Right? The conversations are really for us to understand the beliefs, the values, the experiences, and the aspirations. And when we understand that, it's easier for us to share the findings with you through the 4 panels, for you to be able to dice them. And when you do the ideation, take into context what we found so far and add your own personal experiences. So the first one I'll share in no order of importance. It's how we decided to just organize it for this presentation is to start off with youth. When members of our panel spoke to people from the lower socioeconomic status, it's not that they don't have access to quality education, but it's more that they feel that they are in circumstances and they lack the social capital to succeed. They also feel that there's a lack of empathy. So it's mechanical in terms of the kind of support they get from social service agencies. It's mechanical, it's functional, but there's no empathy. That's what they feel. And because of social stigma attached to their social economic status or their education or the line of work, it has an impact in terms of their mental well-being, which is an area of concern which members of the panel decided that we should to take notice of. And finally, in terms of the opportunities to lead, right, there seems to be a perception that Muslim organizations don't give them enough opportunities to shine. Right, so these are the problem statements that after all the findings, well, I've summarized them into 4, 2 for the youth leadership issues and 2 for mental health. There's a QR code. So if you'd like to know a bit more in terms of more details on the findings, please take out your phone and scan the QR code. I'm sure it would help you in terms of preparing for your discussions in the ideation stage, which will come in subsequently after this. I'll move on to the community advocates panel. So it was an interesting conversation that they had inside. One of the things was the perception, again, of the mismatch between how Muslim professionals have the talent and the expertise, and they believe that Muslim organizations are invite-only clubs. Yeah, that there's barriers of entry for them to come in and for them to contribute. Women as well, that, as I mentioned, there's some gender expectations within the community, some cultural context perhaps, but what can we do in terms of facilitating their contribution? Right. Just recall again in terms of how we have more women here, we have a diploma and more. The area of concern also would be, an observation would be how people are saying that they fear reprisal if, for example, they are being seen as community advocates. And as well, how the system of meritocracy that has given much benefit for us to achieve academic and academic success may also be antithetical to who we believe our belief system as Muslims, where important things like social justice and solidarity could make it seem that, you know, if you are unsuccessful in your life today, it's because you're lazy or it's because you didn't work hard enough. But if we reflect back to what the youth within the panel they are saying, right, some of them feel it's just based on the circumstances that they are. It's intergenerational. So you can see how issues are really complex and they do intertwine. Yeah, so we're not focusing on the issues, we focus on the people. And finally, through their works, they realize that social media has presented itself as a great tool for advocacy. But we also identify that it comes with its danger points. Right? There's echo chambers. So people who say a certain thing, right, they only hear a certain thing and they don't get the opinions of others. And that's where we talk about Islamic values, some of the universal Islamic values like respect, like positive communication between people of different opinions, respectfully. Right? These are some of the prophetic traditions that we have and we can agree on. So 3 key problem statements that you will be discussing if you are part of the community advocate panel. The QR code is there for you to scan for more details. So I've summarized, so I just want to preempt that what you see is the summarized version. It's like a teaser. So when you go into the room, right, and you realize, oh, like it's, it's much more than that. So I preempt you first. Okay. Yeah, but this is a summary. It gives a good picture about some of the discussion. Some of you will be taking through to question 1, some of you question 3. But we will have a panel presentation where you will be free to share your opinion on the other panels or even some of the other questions which you don't have the opportunity to discuss. So I move on to the family panel. More points, because like I mentioned, this is an area of concern, it's an area of priority within the community, so there's much to be said. But one of the commonality we can break it down, if you can see, is one on technology. The impact that technology has on the relationship between parents and the child. And what is the impact that it has in terms of discerning information? At the palm of your hand now, our children will be able to find anything in the world. Anything. Good, bad, ugly. Which leads to the third point in terms of what will the role of parents be? They are stewards of the digital device. Right, so that's the first 3 points on technology. The next few points are more on sexuality, a heated topic currently right now. We get the feeling that parents, or Muslim parents, they're still uncomfortable in terms of sexuality education and discussing it openly. Despite retrospect, at the palm of your hand, everything is available. And also in terms of what the role of Muslim organizations, because this sexuality, this modern sexuality discourse is very complex. It is highly contested. There needs to be a space for Muslim organizations to be involved, right, to hear views. And those are the things which we hear from the community. So we'll be breaking it down into 2 sub-themes, one on technology and one on sexuality. So if you would like to contribute, and if you're not part of this panel, but you'd like to contribute, you can scan the QR code, you can look at what our findings are, and feel free that during the panel presentation, you can be heard in terms of what your thoughts are and what you think some of the ideas we can navigate. Right, the last panel which we intentionally thought that we need to have this in and have the discussion now is the seniors panel. There seems to be a lack of awareness on caregiving services available to the Muslim community or to Singaporeans in general amongst the Muslim community. Points 2 and 3 are quite related, so it's more on the cultural context, the sensitivities. People feel that the services currently right now don't necessarily cater to some of the activities which are important to Malay or Indian Muslim needs on a day-to-day basis. And finally, the advocacy role. So we understand that there's lack of awareness on caregiving services, the type of support that's needed, and also to engage youth to have conversations. So some of these conversations could involve provocative ideas like how do you define filial piety? So if you need to send an elderly person to caregiving, does that make them less filial pious? So I believe these are some of the things which was brought up in the panels to hear ideas and thoughts during the ideation stage from all of our volunteers who have come this morning and are going to contribute to the senior panel. So these are the 3 problem statements that they've identified. So again, these are the watered down summarized versions, right? When you go to your respective breakout rooms, you get the whole gist of the problem statements, and feel free to approach any of the panel members that help to construct these problem statements and the empathy process that they went through. Right, so I'm close to the end of my keynote address, so hopefully I've engaged you and taken you through our journey in terms of how we got here, and it's now going to be your show. It's a process of ideation where I just have 5 points which I request for you to consider as you begin the ideation process. Number 1, please always empathize that we're not talking about statistics or numbers that we're trying to improve. We're always talking about individuals. Feel free to criticize and relook at the problem statements that you see. We're not perfect. So this is the process that I shared with you. This is what we saw. This is who we spoke to. But there are so many other voices and there's so many other opinions that we'll definitely want to hear what they are. Think out of the box, goes without saying. There's new angles which we are trying to look for. As I mentioned, we have a more educated segment of community compared to 10 years ago. And no right or wrong. So again, I come back to the prophetic tradition of us being respectful of each other and agreeing to disagree, and respect that we are all here having conversations and everybody's entitled to their opinion. Yeah. So that's the key point which I would like to request as you go on to the ideation. The last thing which, before we play in the respective panels, because I hope you have fun with us this morning as much as it is a heavy topic, is a pun intended on the word play. So we have a play before we let you go on to your respective breakout rooms and have the ideation. Now, what I request again is that in the play, you'll see characters. So there's 3 characters. So as you immerse yourself in the play, I need a bit of your... I need a bit of the emotions to come in for you to put yourself in their shoes, in the characters. So they'll be talking about some of the issues that they face as individuals. So don't think of them as a statistic. Don't think of them as a segment of think of them as individuals, as human beings, as real life problems, as much as we try to inculcate, as much as we try to include them in the formation of the characters. And from there, if we understand what they're going through, how can we collectively as a community help people who face this as individuals, right, be part of us, be part of our success, and thrive together as a community. So with that, I'll pass it back to Nusha. He'll take you through our next. Thank you very much.